Sam Harris said this was the one Christian apologist that seems to put the fear of God in his fellow atheists, which was a funny quip, but an interesting quote. So at any rate, I was talking to these guys. He's 70, 75 years old. His getting on stage debating days are probably winding down, and so they were thinking, what are we gonna do next?
Did you get Greg's autograph?
I almost did. I've got a signed book for you from the chief of Biola University's apologetics program. Yes, it's all yours. I figured especially for you. So I bring this one up just because he has recently said something that I found very interesting. If you go on This Is Reasonable Faith website, if you go to podcasts, the second tab is called Defenders. And Defenders is basically is a survey of Christian doctrine. And I had heard him say very recently that he believes, so if you wanted to go through all of this material, and it's basically a Sunday school class. He teaches at the Baptist church that he goes to in Atlanta, Georgia. If you go through each one of these, he thinks that it is a seminary level education that he believes is as good or better than most of what seminaries are putting out today. Which, if you've ever wanted to say, hey, is there just, we've got a lot of YouTube learners in here, including me. Can I go to a place and basically get the same education that a lot of the professional Christian ministers would have today? Craig, who I think is probably well enough credentialed to do that, to say this, says if you go through this Defenders course, you will have basically done so. So obviously there's a difference between watching a video and participating in a class, usually in the amount that you retain. But if you retain all the information, or you have a study methodology that helps you do that, he's basically saying if you get done with this, it's essentially a seminary degree. And I thought that was interesting. But in any case, we're making some recommendations for the future for this ministry. And since we sit in a position of some influence, I just put it out to you. Again, any feedback you have on, I know several of you follow this guy to some degree. Any feedback that you have, by all means, pass it to me. And let's see, we'll bounce it off the board and others to see what they think of it. But that was where we were last time. So obviously, I knew that we had a missionary guest to speak last time. I thought they were going to take 15 to 30 minutes of time. I didn't realize they were going to take the whole time, so my apologies, and not warning you ahead of time that this class was principally going to be that and not...
To some degree, we encouraged them.
Did you? Okay, all right.
And you didn't wear a tie at it yet. I mean, I thought you said 10.
Okay, good.
It was worth it. Yeah.
Well then...
You should watch the streams, Pat.
I will do so. Thank you. I'll do that. Do you have... all right, then let's go back. I hesitate to ask this question, but why not? Here we go anyway. Are there any final things that anybody wants to say on unfinished discussion on the moral argument portion where we were talking about what is it to be good, what is it to be moral, what is it to be right, versus what is it to be wrong, evil, bad? Do we want to agree that it is, I don't know where I put it, of course, do we want to agree that loving is equal to good? Perfectly good is somebody who's perfectly loving. Or is there a property on one side or the other that is not a property on the opposite side? As to say, is there any difference between the two? Is there anybody left on that one?
Maybe can we think of any example where someone could be morally good without being loving?
Right.
Or can someone be loving without being morally good? And I don't think that.
I've always had trouble with that.
What's kindness?
Love your enemy.
Yes. So okay, let's say that we do have a problem with that one for a number of reasons, but let's say, let me ask the question. To answer this question, I'll put it back to you. If you are going to, what is it to be good to your enemy? Let's say that for some reason you wanted to be good to your enemy. Obviously what you're saying is, I don't want to be good to my enemy. What I want to be is bad to my enemy. But if you wanted to be good to your enemy, would that be the same as being loving to your enemy? Or is there a way to be good to your enemy that is not loving? Alternately, is there a way to be loving to your enemy that is not good?
I can't conceive of being loving to my enemy, my real enemy, and I've had enemies.
Yes. Okay, well, in that case, that's a different discussion. We will have that one at a later time. But to inform this question, that was the one we were looking for.
I mean, playing law school a little bit. I mean, good equals loving. I mean, if I have a relative dying of stage 4 cancer in horrible pain,
Yes.
and out of love, I want to put them out of their misery.
Yes.
So I increase the morphine drip.
Yes.
Now that's loving.
Yes.
I'm seeing them suffering. I love them. I can't stand to see them suffering. But the laws, a lot of moral laws say that would be immoral.
Well, then it would be unlawful, but would it not be good?
But would it be good
Yes.
to, and a lot of people would say it's not.
Okay, right. But the
Good
same people would
to put
arguably.
somebody to, in that situation
Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
That would be an example I can think of where it might not equal.
Where they might not equal each
Where
other.
they might not equal.
Would you agree, though, that, so let's say that you're the guy who sees this suffering and you say, I would increase the morphine drip. And I'm the rigorous legalist who's like, if you increase that morphine drip, I'm charging you with first-degree murder.
Plus, like I know some religions also believe that euthanasia
That you
is,
can't do that at
is
all.
immoral.
Right.
So not just illegal, but also immoral.
So let me ask, though, isn't it the case that in this, the one that you're talking about, the reason that you want to increase the morphine drip is what you're really saying is, if I were in this person's place, I would wish, which is simply
Have my suffering be ended.
then that is what loving is. Loving is regarding the other person as important as yourself. Whereas what I'm saying is, if I were this person right here, I would not want that. And the reason I wouldn't want that is, fill in the blank of like, I never want to be a lawbreaker, or alternately, I think God commanded us not to, so it's my
My
duty.
faith tells me that it's
Yes.
immoral, euthanasia is immoral.
So it's actually a disagreement over what you and I consider to be
Yeah.
loving. Yeah, okay, I'll buy that, but I think it leaves the equivalence relationship.
Well, the
There.
Buddha seemed to teach that there was a unification between indifference and independence.
Who used to teach?
The Buddha
Yep.
would teach that there's a unification of independence and indifference,
Yep.
and that would supersede both good and loving.
Okay, do you think, whether it supersedes it or not, does it leave good and loving equivalent?
What I'm saying is you're looking for something independent that could potentially be in neither category.
No, I was looking for something that is a property of one side that is not a property of the other. So the color of rabbit's fur is something that's in a category independent of these two things, but it's not, doesn't inform whether this is an equivalence relationship or not.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, that would still work out nonetheless, because independence and indifference could still maintain characteristics within good and loving.
Yes, yeah, but it doesn't put a property on one that's not a property of the other.
Okay.
Where do atheists stand on this issue?
Dennis, where do atheists stand?
What?
Where do atheists stand on this issue? Do you agree that perfectly good is the same thing as perfectly loving?
I'm sorry, I wasn't here last week, so.
Are you here?
Say it again?
If you're here this week, my question for you is perfectly good the same thing as perfectly loving? What do you think? Do you think there's any difference between perfectly good and perfectly loving, or do you think they're the same thing?
Well, I'll go back to, I can't love my enemies, so if I'm perfectly loving, I have to love my enemies, so I have to disagree with that.
And you don't think you would be perfect, that not loving your enemy, so let's say that you don't love your enemy, does that make you fail to be perfectly good? Are you not perfectly good because you don't love your enemy? Do you have to love your enemy in order to be perfectly good?
No.
Okay.
Do the
So-
gaggle of five, or, Doc, or whoever these people that you know, have they debated this, or have they discussed
The
this?
four horsemen of the atheist,
Yeah.
of atheism, the gaggle of five. I don't know if they would, for marketing reasons, like to embrace the latter. And I don't know who the fifth is that we're adding to them.
I thought you named five people.
I may have, but it would have been an error.
Oh.
The
The gaggle of four.
the gaggle of four
Okay.
would,
Have they
think would
discussed
probably-
this issue? Have they?
yes, so Sam Harris's book on the moral landscape, this is the one that we talked about earlier at some length, where he looks to build an equivalence, to do exactly what I'm doing here, to build an equivalence relationship, but he looks to build that equivalence relationship between goodness and well-being, or creaturely flourishing. So now if you said, tell me the properties of creaturely flourishing, and as it turns out, one creature treating another creature the way that maximizes flourishing might turn out at the end of the day to be loving, but Dr. Harris doesn't particularly call that out.
Does humanism disagree with that equation? I mean,
I don't, you don't typically hear atheists and humanists talk in terms of goodness and loving. because since they're moral terms, they're often engaged in a project to say, historically we've thought about these things the wrong way, so they also tend, it seems to me, to avoid the words that have some sort of long religious trappings to them. So for that reason, they probably, if I were one of them, I would avoid using these kinds
They
of
know where it
terms.
leads, and so they're not going to bring it up.
Or they at least know the bias that people are going to come into it with.
Okay.
So what I would say is, one of the reasons I'm in favor of this, other than I happen to think that it's true, is by using these words right here to express the ideas. You're really hard pressed to find anybody that once you get talking to them, won't agree with it. I think once you flesh everything out and you say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but isn't that loving? Okay, I hear what you're saying, but don't you think that's good? By the time you boil it all the way down, like the morphine, the euthanasia example, you realize that you may be wrong about, we may disagree about what's good, you may disagree about what's loving, but the person who disagrees about what is good will always end up on the other side of the equation with the same view they had on this side of the equation, which is why I like this.
You know, scripturally, that's sound.
I think so. I think that the reason that God gives
My
that,
Father is good, and God is loving, and
he at least has both of those properties. Whether
Yes.
those are equivalent properties has to be argued, yes.
So I'm not sure that, I don't disagree with you. I'm not sure I agree with you either, because it feels like maybe perhaps good has a broader meaning. We kind of talked about that, but even morally good. But on the more basic level, I'm not sure what it gets you to prove that those two aren't the same.
Okay, good
So
question. I would say,
why
if your
define
first
that?
statement was correct, that you don't disagree with me, but you don't agree with me either, I'll simply say the law of the excluded middle, I'm going to take the first thing, and so you agree with me.
Just means that I have some thoughts, but I haven't come to a conclusion.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Very good. So why don't I use that?
More importantly, though, the second question is, okay, say that it is true.
Yes,
So what?
right. I'm going to answer the so what with any last comments here.
How strict is your equivalent statement? So, I mean, is this saying that being perfectly good is both necessary and sufficient for being perfectly loving? Or is
Yes,
perfectly
I'm saying
loving-
it's if and only if. If there's one property on the other side by Leibniz's law, they're not identical. And I'm trying to claim true identical relationship between the two. Which is a heavy burden, right? I'm not engaged in an easy project. All the burden is on, all you have to do is show one single example, and that breaks down.
Independence, yeah. That's what I was saying, is independence.
No, but remember what you were saying was there exists some category, I understood you to say there's some category C, let's call this A, let's call this B. I'm saying A equals A, but that there's some category C that is independent of these two things.
No, that I was saying that there could be something that could be considered good that supersedes itself. So it's like self-reinforcing, basically. And what I was saying was that there was a category of notionalization of independence that could be said to be good, that would be independent of loving, that would categorically allow somebody to enter into the category of good. So what I was saying is that it's not
you weren't here when we talked about this, but we're using the word good here in a very strict sense to mean morally good. So if you don't mean morally good by that, then it's not the word we're using.
Yes, I could argue that could be morally good.
You could, but my question is, on what basis is it morally good? And then ultimately, on whatever basis you call it morally good, is it also morally loving? Would it also be loving?
Yeah, no, not necessarily.
Okay, then tell me the example, and a concise example, and then we'll...
So, first of all, with the whole idea here, I don't like throwing away a perfectly good word. And so if they're equal, we don't need good anymore.
Yes.
But it's a good word. But anyway, when I think of the two ideas here, good is more the idea of good, where loving is more the action. To me, there's a little, good is more what's behind the action of loving. So I separate them that way.
Well, let's then, if that's one of your concerns, I would simply say the following. If I say I want to be good to him, or let's say that I want to claim that I love him, and if I love him, then that implies a regard, right? I regard him in an attitude of love. Now, if I actually regard him in an attitude of love, then what that will do is when something manifests itself where I would, if I loved him, I would act, then you can test whether my regard is claimed or real by whether I act or not. That is to say, I claim to love my child, but I watch him about to walk out into traffic and get hit, and I'm indifferent. Maybe he makes it, maybe he doesn't. Then you might be tempted to claim that I say that I love my kid, but I don't really love my kid. And the same is true of goodness. You know, I could say that I'm a good guy, but I watch a kid wander out in the traffic and I'm like, Darwin, you know, would you call me good as a result? And so to me, the regard and the actions, you know how real the regard is by how real the actions are. When those actions are within your power, you're aware of them, you're aware of their moral weight, you know, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, again, just the idea and the doing of it. I mean, God is love, so maybe morally good equals love. To do good and to be loving are more the action, and to, I don't know. It feels like I'm throwing away a word. So.
Well, don't feel that badly. Just realize that maybe what they are synonyms for each other. So what doesn't say that because something can be big and something can be large, that you're like, oh, well, you know, I'm not saying get rid of large or get rid of big. I'm just saying maybe they mean the same thing.
You know what I'm reacting to is sometimes people set you up by saying, wouldn't you agree this is this?
Yeah.
And so I'm really...
Does it feels like a setup?
I was like, maybe until it's not anymore. That's what...
So unusually in this class, this is not a setup. Okay, there's no trap at the end of this one.
I'll agree
This
with
is,
you until I don't anymore.
I kind of assumed that this was going to be a little less controversial than it apparently is. Yes, sir.
I wasn't here for this class originally, but I'm looking at the track good equals good equals good equals good equals, and then there's a little word morally good
Yes.
equals loving. So you really, it appears to me, listening today,
Yes.
that you're discussing morally good
Yes.
as an equivalence for loving.
Yeah, and I apologize. That should have been captured better in the scribblings that we're doing in here, but 3 or 4 weeks ago, we went through 20 minutes of discussion and basically...
And to argue just about good without dressing it up with the phrase morally good.
Yeah, in
changes
this
the meaning entirely.
sense, yes, sir. We mean, we're only talking about morally good. We're not talking about this, well, that's not entirely true. We did try to make I'll give it to you in one sentence, and if it doesn't make sense to you, then I'll refer you back in the interest of time to an earlier video. But someone made the claim of, hey, look, if I asked you, what's a good route into Washington, D.C., and you gave me like a GPS route, here's how you drive from here to Washington, D.C., that there is a moral component there. Because if you sent me to Richmond and then back up to D.C., I might claim that that was not a good route. And the reason it wasn't a good route is that you weren't being loving in considering what my answer to the question was. So although the route itself in this de re ontic referent sense, that no one road is morally superior to another road, in the context you're giving, what the question I'm asking you is, what's a good route to D.C., and you tell me. What I'm really saying is, if you were me and you wanted to drive into D.C. in as little time, expense, trouble and danger as possible, how would you go? And so you should answer that question in the way that you would want me to answer the question if I were asked, if the roles were reversed. To do that process is to be loving, would be my point. So while the route itself might not be good, the fact that you answer the question the way you do is a moral expression. You could send me through a part of town that you know I'll get shot in, or something like that, in which case that you would definitely say that has a moral component. But if you sent me through a route that's going to cost me $10 more in gas or $45 more in tolls, and you did it intentionally, wouldn't you call that morally not good? So
Depends on if it was a pretty
To
route or
avoid
not.
being...
yeah, right, yeah. And then
There's other conditions you can label.
sure. In which case, though, if what you said was, look, everybody in America,
All I'm saying is,
yeah.
I'm trying to eliminate confusion. You're really talking about morally good equals loving, not just good equals loving.
Yes,
That's my point.
that's exactly right. And then I would also add to that, maybe we think less things are moral than actually are in the real world.
Yeah. Here's a curveball for you. If you don't go to your gay friend's wedding, you're doing morally good, but you're not showing love.
If you don't go to your gay friend's wedding,
Right.
you're doing morally good, but you're not showing love.
I disagree that that's morally good.
If you don't go?
If you don't go.
Yeah, right. So you're back, a similar question.
I think get away, for this not to work, you've got to show that there's an aspect of moral goodness that is not relation. Because as soon as you add in a relation, and that's the part I'm kind of struggling with, because say you're on an island entirely by yourself, do you still have moral values and duties that you must? And I would say yes. However,
In relation to whom, though?
that's the question.
Relation to self and relation to God are still left, even if you're on the.
That's exactly right.
Right.
So,
But let's answer his question first, and then
All right,
let's answer
yeah.
this one. So to your point, that one will depend. So let's say that one person says it's good to attend your gay friend's wedding. Another person says it's bad to attend your gay friend's wedding. Okay, so you got the two sides on here. The disagreement is over good and bad. I'll ask you this question let whoever represent it. But you say it's good, and this other person sitting in this chair right here says it's bad. If I said, tell me which one is the more loving thing to do, each one of you will end up saying that whatever your action was, either going or staying away, is actually the most loving thing to do. And that ultimately, when it gets down to it, when you parse it down, you say, why is this good? Why is this bad? When you finally get to the end of it, it's going to get justified in some terms that have to do with whether it's most loving or not most loving. That is to say, the person who says they want to attend is likely to say, it's most loving to show the person affirmation for who they are. You can disapprove of their actions, you can disapprove of this relationship, you can disapprove of whatever, but at the end of the day, you're saying that person in the reverse situation would want to come to my wedding, I would want them to come, that kind of stuff. And so it best shows your regard, and so I think it's most loving. This other person might say something like, it's the same, it's by showing affirmation for that, you're encouraging, you're enabling, or whatever, them to do this other thing. So at base, although it's a tough thing to do, it's a tough love, it's still the most loving thing to do. And what I would say is, I would bet you, I am betting you that when you parse it, that's what's going to end up happening between the people who disagree. One of them's right and one of them's wrong. So it doesn't help us discover who's right and wrong, but both of them are still going to stick to an equivalence relationship between good.
Good. An easier example would be the one Jesse mentioned last week, I think, or a couple weeks ago. God punishing his enemies. That would be good, but I don't see how that would be loving.
Fair point. So,
Or God killing his own son.
right,
That one.
right.
So I think you could totally, so it comes down to, we were actually having a sidebar. It comes down to loving the individual versus loving at the aggregate, right? He sacrificed his own son out of love for people. You could also talk about how it was all part of the plan anyway, how Jesus was God, so it gets kind
So
of
I think
right?
there's some similarities obviously between these questions. So in short, no, we're not done with this. All right, let's keep going.
Sorry.
No, this is good. Ultimately, this is the kind of thing we're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to strip this all the way down to the bare bedrock. That's what we want to do. So hold your arms for 1 second. This one's going to take a minute because we got two different questions here. First, I'm tempted to get out of this one easily by saying God didn't kill his own son. Right? The landowner in Jesus' parable sends several servants, the prophets, to the nation of Israel, and they're like, they beat one and they throw out the other and all this other stuff. And he's like, if I send my only son, then perhaps they'll whatever. And they're like, we can, and they kill him and they toss him out. So you could probably try to make the biblical case that no, God didn't kill Jesus, so I don't have to answer the question. But let's say that he at least sent him in knowing that he wasn't going to make it out.
Conditions were set in
Yes.
the passive voice,
Right.
that he was going to die.
Okay. Now let's tie that together with Al's question of like God destroying his enemies. How is that loving? Now I'll give you the back of the napkin embroidery daily devotional card answer to this one, and then we can go deeper into it because you guys aren't going to be happy with that. But the easy answer is C.S. Lewis's answer, which is there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. And I go back to Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, who said, if there is a heaven, I don't want to go, because it's a divine North Korea where the great leader and his son, the dear leader, are going to tell me how I have to live my life. And I would literally rather go to hell than be bossed around by somebody who thinks that killing his own son is an okay thing to do. Hitchens has sat in moral judgment of God or his idea of God and said, I don't want to be around that guy. And so if you handed him two options and you're like, which one do you want? He's like, give me option B. Now you may claim that sounds absurd. And maybe he was saying that as a rhetorical device or just a point of attack, or et cetera. But if it's the case that, let's use an easier version of it. Let's say, just for argument's sake, I'm not making this case here today, that hell is not some eternal conscious torment in this medieval idea of Dante's Inferno. What if it's simply obliteration? So it would be then easy for Chris Hitchens to be like, do I live in heaven or do I get obliterated? Obliterate me because I don't want to live with you jerks. That's basically the way Hitchens would put it. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Hitchens saying, I listen to everyone.
I know, and as soon as I said Chris Hitchens, I knew you were going to be on.
You're right in your quote, except that he did not say, I'd rather go to hell. He just said, I don't want to go to that heaven.
Yes, but I think the question was asked by a Christian with the background. So I agree that nobody wants, that maybe you say.
He didn't say, I'd rather go to hell. He just said, I don't want to go to this. So let's
Okay,
go to
very good. And let me leave Christopher Hitchens off as a clear expression of that. And let me say instead, I think I asked this question, I did, on that survey on that problem of good and evil. So I put a 1,000-person survey out, and I asked a number of questions. One of them was, if you were in the biblical Garden of Eden, would you eat the fruit, knowing what you know today is the result? And something like a third of the respondents said they would go ahead and eat the fruit anyway, knowing what would occur. And I got a second question that was in that vein, and I got an almost statistically identical answer. The most informative question, or at least the most interesting question to me, was I said, would you rather live in a perfect utopia where there is no evil, it's only good, but you're basically beholden to obey the commands of an all-knowing, all-loving, all-good God who's only going to tell you the right thing to do? Or would you rather live in a world that has evil in it, but you can do whatever you want? 50% of people said they would rather live in a world with evil. They would rather live in a broken world because they don't have to listen to somebody who already loves them more than anybody else can. That literally, that was the correct answer. Now, I can't guarantee that everybody understood the question in the same way that I understood it in asking, but the fact that half the people were like, I'd rather live in the broken world and be my own boss, is not dismissible, right? That's not something you can just be like, no big deal. So what I mean there is, yeah, I think it's realistically the case to say that there are people who would say, I do not want to go to heaven, if this is what heaven is. And alternately, or really what they're saying is, I don't want to trust and obey God. Now, here's the question of how is it loving? I go back to the horrible example I've given you, of you have two sons, and one of them has just hit the end of his rope, and he comes into the house and pulls a gun on everybody in the house and is pointing it at the other son, and you see him about to squeeze the trigger. For those of you that remember the example, I'm not breaking it all out entirely, but basically, as horrible as it is, you end up pulling the trigger on the guy, on your son, in order to save the life of your other son. So is it loving? Yes. Is it loving towards the shooter? At that point, you can't answer the question of what is loving towards the shooter, because the shooter has given up his ability to interact in a way. He's gone so far to the lethal side that in order to show love for the innocent, or presumably innocent in this case, other son, you have had to do what you've had to do. If the answer is that utopia, perfect loving relationship, which everybody claims they want, is only achievable by keeping people out who are absolutely committed to wrecking it, not because they want to wreck it, but because they want to follow their own way, then the only way to be loving to the people who are not that way is to get rid of the people who are that way. You got two options. You can either get rid of them entirely and destroy them, or you can quarantine them. And then I leave to you and to the theologians whether hell is some form of punishment that's torturous, whether hell is obliteration, or whether hell is quarantine, where you let the people who want to live in that world live together, and you let the people who want to live in this world live together. Now, the argument against letting that last forever would be, is it loving to those people to live in that world? Now, that's another question you have to answer, but it at least informs the why there's this dichotomy.
Well, couldn't a similar argument be made for someone like Hitler? Like he wants the best people to thrive, so killing these people would be beneficial to society.
So, yeah. In that, I think there are probably at least three ways you could answer that question. One is the easy one, which is, well, Hitler's wrong about what makes a good society. Okay, and okay, he's just wrong. The second is, he may be right in the aggregate that we would suffer less genetic mutations if you only allow. Of course, that turns out to be false. On the number of mutations we all carry is enormous. But let's say that something like that were true. That somehow there was some sliver of society that were just had less harmful mutations than others did, and if you could just select those, eventually you'd have people that could live 700 years and not get cancer and all this other stuff. And so for the good of society, it's better to do that. That's where you turn around and say, where do rights start? Do rights start with whatever makes us live the longest is what is the good? Do rights start with whatever makes us encounter the least amount of challenges is what is the good? And I think we would go down this list and say, no, that's not what the good is. That's not what the good is. That's not what the good is. But the good often happens in the face of those, or using those as tools to show us what is good, or to establish character and long suffering and all these other things that we do call noble traits. So at the second level, we might just say he's entirely mistaken, and his understanding of where rights derive from is erroneous. But if instead you say, okay, no, why is that not similar in that at least that seems to be God's justification of this is what is, and that God's saying that the end justifies the means. Here's the end, people living in happiness completely, and therefore anything I have to do to get people in there is good to go. I would say this. I think that there is an intersection of ends justify the means, of all moral codes. So utilitarianism say the ends justify the means. If the end that you want, let's say, typically speaking, people see a difference in utilitarianism and in some sort of religious-based moral theory as saying, well, these guys say the means, what you do in the means is what is moral, and that's what gives meaning to the end. Whereas these guys say, no, what is in the end is what gives morality to the means. And so these are obviously different approaches, unless both approaches are targeted at a single similar thing. If the utilitarian agrees that what you really, really want is people living in a maximally loving environment, if you want utopia, and you say, well, what is utopia? And utopia isn't just people who are materially prosperous. If utopia means that you love him and he loves you and we love each other and everybody treats each other like brothers and sisters that you love, that everybody treats each other exactly how they would want to be treated. If that's the goal, then the utilitarian is forced to say, well, if that's the goal, then loving each other is the means to achieving that goal. And the religious person says loving each other is the means to achieve that goal, and it turns out that those two are actually identical. So it's goal dependent when you look at a lot of these moral systems. And that's my point, is if you focus any given moral system, it seems to me, on an outcome where the outcome is living in perfect love with each other, all of them seem to me to reduce to the same thing. They all make the same prescriptions and proscriptions, which should be very meaningful. What it should do is say, that's very, very interesting. When you target all these things together and they all become one single system, they all collapse in on each other, maybe you've really discovered something true, that which is good is that which is loving. Now, here's the question. Remember, loving entails free will, and free will entails choice in some way. And you can't have love without free will and choice. And if you can't have choice, if you can't have that without it, you have to have a choice between at least two things. And as it comes to final outcomes, that choice entails participation in utopia and not participation in utopia. So if you happen to disagree that utopia is living in perfect love, if you think utopia is you guys live however you want, but I'm in charge, then you will disagree about whether you want to be in what God calls utopia. Because God's utopia is one where maybe we would say he's in charge, but in reality he doesn't have to be in charge because we've all bought off on the idea of being all loving, in which case he doesn't have to issue any orders. In the same way that God said, here's all these laws and ordinances and whatever else, but Jesus says all of these reduce, all the law and the prophets hang on love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, love your neighbor as yourself. This is all the law and the prophets together. If that's true, then us wanting to be like God, us wanting to be all loving, means we don't have to consciously turn around and follow these laws. Did God say I'm not to murder somebody? He did. Okay, I won't murder this person. That chain of thought doesn't enter your mind if you actually love them. It never becomes a question to you. So if you adopt a view like that, morality actually gets fairly easy. It just basically turns into an exercise of putting yourself in the other person's shoes, and also trying to understand how that works a few levels out. Okay, Dennis, your point, and then I'll tie this one off.
Just to clarify Hitchens, there is a third option. You've got your heaven, you've got hell, whatever that is, and then you've got the option of nothing.
Yeah.
And Hitchens believed in nothing. He just believed you die.
You die and that's it. Yeah, I made that point about basically being obliterated. So maybe that's a possible end, and maybe that's what I was saying. Hitchens would probably choose. If Hitchens had live in heaven with Jesus, or just be obliterated, he would choose to be obliterated. That would be my guess, but he didn't tell me that. I saw another hand. No? Okay. All right. If you take that to be something like correct, then
Yeah.
what? Did I leave somebody unanswered? What? I left Al unanswered. Sorry. How about God hating his enemies?
I can see how love would fit in as far as God loving himself and his moral standard, and but as far as God destroying his enemies, that's you could say that's out of love for himself.
Well, I would say I point that back to I would say that you got to work the analogy a little bit, but I want to claim that the analogy of your two sons, one of them's threatening the life of the other one,
Okay.
that's the equivalent situation. So just remember, like even in the Old Testament, we tend to think of I hear people all the time say Old Testament God is wrathful and vengeful and like zero tolerance, and New Testament God just loving and whatever else. And I'm like, have you read both of them again? Because Old Testament God was like, the Canaanites are throwing babies in the fires, and they're doing insane things to each other, and I'm still waiting around in the hopes that they'll turn it around. And I'm waiting for their sin to come to its fullness before I go roll in on them. And then even when he did roll in on them, it wasn't like, hey, Israel, put 12 hands of a clock, go put a tribe on each one of the numbers, and then we're going to squeeze in together and we're going to get rid of all of them. What was the warning? The warning was, here comes God's nation. Your land, you have lost the right to your land. This is now God's land. Get off. And they're like, we're not getting off, we're staying. They're like, we said get off. We're not getting off, we're staying. All right, we're coming. All right, we're mounting an army and we're coming out to meet you. All right, now you're all gone. Right? It's that is a far cry from hey, we're just going to wipe out everybody. Now that doesn't answer, like the flood was wipe out everybody. So if you're going to make hey, God's making some tough moral decisions, I would point to the flood before I would point to invasion of Canaan. But then I would point to the New Testament to be like, Peter has a minor accounting question for someone, and they answer the wrong way and they die on the spot. That doesn't sound like in the I'm giving them a lot of room for mercy. So I would simply say that would hypothesize that the standard for what is good and right and moral and loving has actually stayed the same across all of Scripture.
Good and loving. So, two different words. You're saying they have all the same meanings, at least morally good. My hesitance, again, they're the same until they're not. They each have, you're saying that it's completely overlapping. I'm saying there's no way to know if they're completely overlapping because there might be something where they're a little off and there's something outside because we can't come up with it.
You're right to say that there's no way to know that for sure without all knowledge everywhere.
Unless we just decide that that's how we're going to define it.
But it's the easiest possible way. So the advantage to making the statement the way that I did is that I have made it as easy as possible for any opponent of this view to disprove this. They don't have to turn around and prove that every case equals like that. All they have to do is show a single one. Now, you can't make it easier for the opposition, and so I'm comfortable in standing on that position if it lasts over time.
Which is why I keep saying it is until it's not anymore.
But that's true of absolutely any knowledge that we have whatsoever. And what we can do is say the stuff that we can be most confident in is stuff that's expressed in such a way, and people are like, yeah, I would like to attack that, and let me get back to you. You know, that you can be fairly highly confident in.
So to say that to be loving is to be good, would that be a tautology? And if so, would it matter?
It's not framed in logical terms as a tautology. The tautology is to be loving is to be loving. But if what you said is the definition of good is to be loving, and so I'm going to pull, so to be good is to be loving is not, you know, this is where philosophers are going to get accused of splitting hairs here. They'll say formally that's not strictly a tautology. It's only strictly a tautology when you use the exact same word, the exact same letters here as you do there. The rest of us normal human beings are going to be like, that seems like it's kind of splitting hairs, doesn't it? And the philosopher will say, splitting hairs is our business.
Then using this, wouldn't it be morally good to be homosexual and in some cases divorce?
Why?
Well, because two consenting homosexual adults loving each other, isn't that morally good? And then in divorce, you know, sometimes it's better for the kids if the parents split up or if they're not in love anymore.
So if you don't dig any further down into that one, I would say yes, that would be the case. Now, where I would challenge it is this: is it good to? Is it actually loving to do that? So let's say that so like I love Peter, right? We're buds. I like him. I would give him the shirt off my back if they called. Hopefully, if they called, hey, we're in real trouble, I would use my resources to rescue he and his family from trouble, and vice versa. Let's say that's the case. That does not entail a sexual relationship. So if what we're saying is, well, it would be pleasing to us as well to put a sexual component into a relationship that's already loving. The question is, where does the sexual component come into showing the other person love? Do you know what I mean? So if your answer is, well, if you love someone, you have sex with them, I'll say, well, that society may tell you that, but show me what the linkage between sex and love really is. If love is a benevolent selfless regard for someone else. So what that says is, okay, well, but I can say that. This other person desires a sexual relationship with me. Okay, that may be the case. But now consider two other people. Here I am married to my wife, and there's some other lady out there whom I also love, and not, let's say wrongly love, let's just say I love her like we're supposed to love brothers and sisters. And she, however, does desire a sexual relationship with me. And I say, okay, well, if I'm being loving, I'm putting myself in her shoes, then all right, I'm going to go have a sexual relationship with her, right? Good for justifying your own adultery, but it leaves you a couple steps short, doesn't it? Where does it leave you obviously short? Your wife is going to feel like that's not loving towards her. So it's also so not only could you say, well, in order to do so, I have to not be loving to this person. All right, but we have this same conundrum when it comes to shooting your son. Who's going to shoot your other son, right? But who was the innocent person in this relationship? Arguably your wife. So shooting the hostage is not the right moral thing to do. I think we can all agree. But forget your wife for a second and look at this other lady. She may desire a sexual relationship with you, but is that good for her? Because remember, love is about a benevolent, selfless regard for someone else. So it would be selfless to say, I'll sacrifice the happiness of my own marriage to gratify this person's desires. That's certainly selfless of you, or maybe it's not that selfless, depending on what you think of this other person. But let's say that you made that decision selflessly. You failed to consider the other half, which is the benevolence. Is it good for this person to do this? So this has always been my question. I've never understood this whole, like, I'll have an affair with somebody and then we'll get married. On what possible grounds do you think that they won't do that again? Or that they don't think that you won't do that again, if you've shown that that's the case. And so trust disappears rapidly, because all the person has to do is to turn around and say, I was with this woman, I left her, I've dumped my vow that I made with her in order to be with this person. Now we've made a vow to each other. If you have two brain cells to rub together, you have to ask the question of, why should this relationship last any more firmly than that one did? In which case, this person the entire time ought to be saying this: we're in this relationship right up until he finds someone he would prefer to be with. In which case, trust is gone. Now, I would argue that in no possible world is a set of relationships like that one loving. Like that just doesn't maximize loving. And so what I would actually say is my objection to homosexuality outside of the biblical injunction, if I ignore biblical injunction about what to do and what not to do in that case, I want to say that, simply speaking, you can love somebody of the opposite sex without being married to them, without being with them in that kind of relationship, because that is going to leave you devoid of a lot of good out there. Let's say, for instance, that you're both capable of having children. You're both male. You're both capable of having children. For those of us who are parents and who have been blessed to have, good kids and in a good stable home or whatever else, or even if not, isn't it the case that you say there's a part of life that I would have missed out on, that prior to having kids I would have said that's not important. I was like, that's not important to me. It's, I don't have kids. I don't have kids. I don't care. Then you have kids and you're like, oh, I had no idea. This is amazing. Now, it's not, God doesn't give that to everybody, but in my own life, what I would say is this: Scott without kids, level of happiness, I thought 10. Turns out it was 5 or 1. Scott level of happiness with kids, 10. That's the new 10 or whatever else, And so just because we think it makes us maximally happy does not equal that it makes us maximally happy. The person who's maximally loving both knows what would make the other person most happy and then also hopes that for them. That's the good that they want for them. So if you look at somebody who's a homosexual and you say, yes, you'll be 5 level happy living with this other guy, but what you don't know about yourself, brother, is that if you could, change a little bit of your mindset and instead love this girl and you guys have kids together and this relationship was loving and this relationship was loving, that this is a 10 compared to your 5. If that were true, I'm not saying that that's true, but if that were true, you would have reason for not wanting that person to be in a homosexual relationship. So I'm not making an argument that this is the case, but I'm saying if that is the case, now you have grounds for disagreeing. Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, that's just what I was going to say. You said you're not making the case. Well, I could have made the same case. Well, you're missing out if you're not having homosexual intercourse.
Yes. So the question is, at this case, obviously this class has gone to PG and we're getting close to R at this point, but that's okay. Yes, you are missing out, but which of the two is the greater good?
That just depends on what they want. Because some people are perfectly happy not having kids. They'd rather not have kids than
So let
have
me
kids.
turn that one around and say this. I'm a little bit of an alpha male, right? And alpha males, this is a caricature, but like you show up into a room full of people and your first thing is like identify the strongest guy, try to beat him up, identify the prettiest girl, attempt to mate, and then establish a sled team after that, right? So that's what an unrestrained alpha male does. Maybe a caricature of what an unrestrained alpha male does. But let's say at least it's the case that some number of guys, some non-zero number of guys, would prefer multiple female sexual partners to one. Unrestricted, they're just like, I'd rather sleep with 5 girls than 1 girl. Okay? I'm one of those guys, probably. I would say that's the case. But I don't do that. And the reason I don't do that is, while I think that I might want to do that, I'm taking God's word on it that I'll actually be happier if I stick with the way that He says to do it. Now, what I'll tell you is my life experience over the past, 17 years, have led me to believe that God's way of doing it is in fact going to make me maximally happy. So yes, have I lost out on adultery, on committing adultery with 4 or 5 other women? Yes, certainly I've lost out on. That assumes there would be willing participants on the other side, which is probably not the case. But let's say that I've missed out on that one. Have I missed out on a good? Maybe that would have been a pleasant relationship. So you could say I've missed out on a good, but that's not what you want for the other person. What you want is the best thing. Now, what you mean by good there is something that is at least temporarily feels good. But you can make that argument for drugs. You can make that argument for being a drunkard. You can make that argument for rage killing. It feels good in the moment to kill but once you're the person who's done you wrong, but what does it leave you with in the aftermath? And so you can't ignore aftermath when you talk about the morally good. And my point would be to the man in a marriage relationship who may say, look, by nature, I can't help it, I'm born that way. And it's not something that I can just turn off my desire to do it. I will always desire other women. But it's better if you actually understand what is good in the long run. What is best for you is not to do that. And that is identically the case with the homosexual, in my opinion. And so my objection to homosexuality isn't that they can't enjoy and have fun. My point is they're going to be missing out on so much more in exactly the same way that the person who's not faithful to his wife will be. Not because there's a similarity in unfaithfulness. A homosexual may say, no, it's just me faithful to one person. See, those are the same. I'm saying, yes, but this relationship doesn't bring you what this relationship brings you. That would be my argument. That would be part of how I made the case. Obviously, make more time to do it, more evidence, but in the interest of time, that was where I was going.
I forgot the real reason I raised my hand, because it was up for so long. His question made me forget it, and you didn't answer it. My son is a homosexual. He's now 50-some years old. He's been legally married in Massachusetts to his significant other, whatever, I don't know if he's a husband or a wife or what, for 25 years. Now, he raised the question, they don't want children, neither one of them ever did, and they didn't get hooked up until they were in their mid-20s. They did not want children. So your answer is really not relevant. They are happiest together, being together, having sex, and only being with each other. Now, why isn't that a loving relationship that is just as good as, say, mine with my wife?
So,
Him with his wife.
yeah, before you got married, Dennis, did you want children?
Yeah.
Okay, I did not.
Well, that's you. You're changing the subject now.
No, I'm sticking to the subject. Now, remember, your son and I now are more similar than you and I are, at least in that property. Neither he nor I wanted children. You did want children, so you're the odd one out right now. So your son and I both didn't want children. Turned out, I'm just telling you in my own personal experience, I was wrong about that.
Well, he still doesn't want children.
He's not going to. The question is, I would not have known that I wanted children until I had them.
What if he had said, okay,
Okay.
this is wrong for me to be with Norman, his guy, so I'm going to get married and have children, and now I don't want him, and now it's screwed up.
Right. So if again, this is why I made the caveat of like, you have to love your wife has to love you have to love your kids and all that, but a loving relationship where you have kids, I would challenge anybody in the room to find somebody who would say the following: my wife and I live in a perfect or near perfect relationship, that is to say we love each other, we're committed to each other, maybe we've had bumps in the road, but at the end of the time we're happily married, we're very happily married. And we have had kids who we love the kids and the kids love us. Okay, let's say that's the end state in which they live. And you ask that person, knowing what you know now, would you rather have lived with your wife without the kids or with them? I know. I'm just saying every person that I have ever met, and this is anecdata, has said, oh, well, I didn't even understand. Some people say I didn't even understand what love was truly until I had my own kids and blah, blah, blah. Look, there are people that aren't going to have kids. There are people who aren't going to get married. There are people who are eunuchs, sterile, all the kinds of stuff. I get it. And I'm not saying they all end that way. But my point would be, it's not that he's not happy. It's not, I would maybe most succinctly say it this way, Dennis. What we think we want and what's good for us are very rarely the same things.
Look,
right?
Heterosexual couples who don't want children and never have children.
I understand. I'm not saying that's universally the case. I'm making a probabilistic argument. I'm not saying in every single case having kids would be the right answer for that person.
A single case where it is the case, like he brought up, and with my son.
I'm making a proposition that your son thinks he would be most happy in this relationship. In reality, he would be more happy. He would be happier if he lived a different way. That's all I'm saying.
No.
I know you can say no, but that's the argument I'm making. And the empirical support I'm bringing for that is everyone, including me, who has walked that apparently less pleasant road of denying themselves adulterous relationships, of denying themselves homosexual relationships that they otherwise would desire, of denying themselves vengeance that they would want to have. Everybody who has denied that has said, looking back on it, I'm very, very glad I did things the way that I did.
What if you had never had children?
Then I wouldn't
know you would. How do you know that wasn't where you were really going to be?
What I'm saying is I did for a while not have children. And up until that point, I'm telling you that my level of happiness, even the happiness, I thought I was as happy as I could be.
But you weren't married then.
I was married at that time and didn't have children.
Good with kids.
Right, yeah. I mean, if it wasn't for my wife's wanting kids, we would not have had kids.
What if you never had kids? How do you know you wouldn't have been even happier.
Well, I've got at least 33 years of data where that was the case. And over those 33 years of data, when I compare it to the, like more than that, 38 years of data or whatever I'm at, where I didn't have kids. And I thought I was as happy as I could possibly be. And then I had kids, and I was like, this does not represent 1/10 the happiness that I would have had otherwise.
Getting back to my original point, you can't just say that all homosexual couples are unhappy and would be happier if they weren't.
I have never said that. I said homosexual couples, many of them are happy.
The species wouldn't propagate. We wouldn't be still here if this. If it wasn't.
Forget that argument. Just sticking on the happiness argument. My point isn't homosexual couples can't be happy. My point is homosexual couples cannot be maximally happy.
You can say that, but you can't justify it.
I just spent 30 minutes justifying it. Didn't I not? Right?
But you can't convince him.
Maybe not, but that's because of a pre-commitment that you have in a very difficult situation. If your son were my son, of course I'm going to defend him as much as I possibly can. But at the end of the day, even those parents, my children are young, so I have less room on this one. But all of us, when we grow up and our children make it to adulthood, would say, I love my son, I love my daughter. I think their life would have been better if they had not chosen to do A or B or whatever else. And that doesn't mean that you love them less. It actually means that you love them more. It's easy to turn around and be like, oh, whatever they want is good. But that's just intellectually and morally lazy. To turn around and say what they got is what they want most. Who among us has that ever been the case? That what we got is what we wanted most? Like that's almost nobody. So you can't reasonably adopt a position and say, as their lives went, that's the best they could possibly be. All parents, if they're being honest, turn around and say, I think it would have been better if Timmy or Sally or Freddie did this instead of that. Now the question is, where are you right and how far should that go? And that's all I'm exploring here today.
I just wanted to add also that I know that you said you're trying to maximize your own happiness by having children, but yet if you take out the God element and you don't experience God, then having children doesn't necessarily mean happiness.
I'm 100% in agreement with that. And so if what you heard me say was, no, listen, gay people, just have children and you'll be happier. I went to some length to not make that point. What I said was, if you're married to someone of the opposite sex with whom you can have kids, and by the way, you can have kids, and you have a loving you're happily married to them, you would say that you're fairly close to maximally happy with that person, and you have kids, then you might be one of the people in whom so there's a lot of ifs in there. And the ifs actually all correlate to all the moral duties you have in the same way that you had asked a question. I'd answer your question by saying, I and the adulterer and adulteress leave off a good that could have been done here in order to not violate this good. That it's the sum of all of these moral duties that leads to maximal happiness. So you actually can't make a truly optimal moral decision without considering what your decision is going to do, not only to the person with whom you're dealing and yourself, but the persons with whom they're dealing and the persons with whom they're dealing, and let this thing go out all the way around the earth as far as it goes. To which you throw up your hands and say, well, good grief, if that's the way if you have to know that much in order to know what is morally right, then who could possibly know what is morally right? And the answer is only somebody who knows all of those effects and then turned around and issued a set of statements meant to maximize those effects. Does that point resonate, hopefully, a little bit? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Who is the judge on what is maximum happiness here?
God, in this case. But let's pretend that you could let's pretend that our lives were a lot simpler than they really were. And that you could sit down. Is anybody tracking this Last Jedi stuff? So the Last Jedi? No, Rise of Skywalker, this next Star Wars movie. For the geeks in the room, that you may know that the rumors out there, I'm pretty sure that they're seeding, this is all seeding operations to build up, but they're basically saying they shot an original version of the movie and they tested it with 3 audiences: hardcore fans, people who are familiar with Star Wars, and people who would go see the next Little Mermaid movie. And that each of those test audiences, the first run of the movie was so bad that many of the hardcore fans literally walked out. and that that overall, like 20% of people thought it was a good movie. And so the people lost their minds, and they read it in another version, they test screened another version, and it tested at 60-something%. The next one tested at 80%. So imagine that your life was like that. That what you could do is sit in a theater and watch the 10 ways that your life might turn out. Okay, so you sit there and you watch them all, and then God turns to you and is like, all right, your choice. Which one do you want to live? You can live any of these. Which one do you want? Which one would you choose?
Mr. Nobody, it's the movie.
Well, is that, yeah, maybe this isn't a new, okay. Then if there's another version of this one, then I'm just ripping it off. I was unaware of that one. But imagine that that's the case. How would you actually would have to know? So if I showed you the first act only, and I was like, which one do you want? The question is to be like, how does the movie end? You're like, I don't know which one I want because I don't know how the movie ends. What you have to know is, how does it go all the way to the end? What is the ending of the movie? What really happens in here? And then you could choose which one that you really want. Well, God's the only one who knows that. And this is why, in my opinion, every moral decision boils down to one question. Do you trust God or do you not trust God? Every moral decision boils down to just that question. If God actually knows that movie thing that I just said, and he really does love you. So say you believe that God exists, you believe that he knows that kind of stuff, and you believe that he loves you. What's the obvious question? What's the obvious conclusion about which movie he's going to want you to have? It's the same one that you would choose for yourself, the one that leaves you the happiest at the end of it. So if you are working on the assumption that what God wants is for you to live the happiest version of the movies of your life, then it may be the case in the same way. If you've seen there are movies that explore this theme, but ultimately you know it's the case that in some cases, like if I tell you the end of what's going to happen, then you would not end up making choice A or B that would actually lead you to that kind of thing. So there are some things that God can't tell us because we would choose something differently. There's some things we wouldn't understand at the time, that kind of thing. So if you work all that out, you're left with this. God is going to say, I want you to, you and I agree, you want to live movie 7. Okay? So now I have to erase your memory so you can lead, of knowing how movie 7 ends. I'm going to erase your memory, I'm going to put you back here, but you and I agree on the following, right? When I ask you to do something, you're going to trust me and you're going to do it. Because you know I love you and you know that I want you to end up on movie 7. And you're like, yep, that's right, got it. So the right path in life is, in fact, trusting God that he's going to lead you, that his requests of you, his commands to you, his loving injunctions to you are only and solely about leading you to movie 7 and her to movie 3 and him to movie 4, where all of those represent the best possible happiness that you could have. Remembering that as the credits roll, that's just the beginning of the real movie, which is living forever in utopia.
God has different ways for us to experience that happiness.
God has different
ways for us to experience that maximum happiness.
No, there's only one way for God to experience maximum happiness. No, I'm saying there are 10 movies. I probably didn't call it out. Movie 1, we're going to make up a scale. Leaves you at happiness level on a scale of 1 to 10 of 1. Movie 2 leaves you at a happiness level scale of 4. Movie 3 of 6. Movie 4 of 2. And by movie 7 leaves you on a 10 of 10. So that movie 7 is the version of your life that leads you to that leaves you at the happiest possible level of happiness, the maximal level of happiness.
For all of us.
For you, and he's also done he's doing these screenings with everybody else. And then what he does is say, given that your movie is number 7, your movie is number 4, your movie is number 16, your movie is number 21, he then turns around as a maximal chess player he is, and he's like, all right, now I have to weave all of these together so that they actually exist in these relationships where you living movie 7 is his living movie 16.
So then why is his son wrong for living his movie version number 3?
Yes.
And me living my version 7. So why would his son be wrong for living his version of that movie?
Because in your movie 7, you disobey none of God's orders. And in his movie 16, he disobeys none of God's orders. That the way to maximal happiness is actually to maximally obey God's orders.
That's given they both have a relationship with God.
Correct. Yes. Now, so what happens is that if we now we're getting complex, but basically, Justin says, yeah, I see that movie 4 is the one that makes me happiest, but I'm either not going to listen to you, and so even though I said I want 4, God and I agreed that I want 4, I'm going to go off and make choices that end in 8. Okay? So, and this is what ends up happening, in my opinion. God's like, okay, I see that he should do 4. I know that he's going to do 8. But given that he's going to do 8, I'm going to bring him into your movie. And part of him living his movie 8, which is not what's going to make him the happiest. It's actually going to make him less happy. But that's what he chose to do. He didn't listen to God. He listened to himself instead. Now he's going to be less happy. He's living movie 8. Movie 8 actually inserts him into your script. And that's part of what puts a choice in front of you that when you make the right choice, brings you to movie 7. He's the villain in your movie. Right? And that's part of what God does is people in God's movie, God doesn't write the villain in. God writes all good people in, and when the good people choose, when people who could otherwise be good choose to be villains, he then lets them play in other people's movies as the villains. That's what ends up happening.
2 quick points. So couldn't, like, his son adopt a child and then they have the same happy maximum level of happiness like you talked about? And then you also talked about how homosexuals who haven't had kids can't experience the maximum greatness like you have. But couldn't they say you can't experience the maximum greatness until you have homosexual intercourse?
Yes, let's say, yeah, so the question then is now you're up to a subjective judgment of, is it better, I'm claiming that I thought that they were at a 5, but that really they could be at a 10 if they did this one. But what if I'm wrong? What if it works this way? That does depend on what your judgment is of what makes you the happiest. So I'm not saying that you can necessarily, that you could sit here and do the thought experiment in order to come up with the right answer. I think you have to go look for data. I really do think you have to go look for data. And these are the kinds, and this is where the data do matter. And I think God lets the data be out there. But if, like my uncle is homosexual as well, right? So it's easy, I don't want to go too far down this path because you can always be like, well, his relationship that was long-term broke up and see, he wasn't happy. But you can make the same case for somebody that was in a heterosexual relationship and it broke up and they weren't happy, whatever. All I'm saying is when you run the numbers all the way down, and let's run the numbers on homosexual couples who, to be clear, for those that don't know the homosexual lifestyle, coupling off in man-to-man relationships, especially on the male side, is rare. That's the exception to the rule. The rule is not that. And the rule is not that on the heterosexual side, right? It's usually not heterosexual males don't have one sexual partner either. So it's, it's certainly not a myth. It's just not, it's not the only case. So let's say that, let's put it in there and say 1 out of 4, that's, the number's lower than that, but 1 out of 4 want to be these long-term monogamous couples. And let's say that that's an equivalence in heterosexual relationships that end up failing. And that's the homosexual mono-mono relationships that fail, homosexual mono-mono relationships where they stay lifelong partners. Heterosexual that fail, heterosexual lifelong partners. In the we can probably agree that the failed ones represent the lower end of happiness. So now we're going to compare the successful ones in here. Now, how do you do a cross-sectional comparison of, not sectional, how do you say which one of these is more happy or less happy compared to what they would otherwise have been? I think that's where you have to go to reported happiness data, that kind of stuff. And you have to take into account experiences that say people who have had children of their own, and you have to actually look at, do people who have their own kids, are they happier than people who have adopted kids? I think the answer is probably no, but it seems, we could ask him, he's had both. Of course, when you're on the record, you can't be like, yeah, well, didn't want to say this, but I love the adopted kid way more than the rest of them. I just don't tell the rest of my kids that.
Abby, we think you the other.
Yeah, the rest of we got dealt that hand. And you do what you can do, but thank goodness for you. Yeah, right. So it's a complex analysis. I'll admit that. But my point would be, if we come at it honestly, at least in the immediate case that we know ourselves, the only case we can know ourselves to some degree, how has my own actions, when I've done when I've done that which God has commanded versus that which God has not commanded. So I would almost ask this question. This is not a complete answer, but it would give you a partial answer. The complete answer is, let's go look at the data that exist on all these things. But if you want to answer it subjectively in your own case, I would challenge you to this. Have you ever heard a moral order that you believe God would want you to do that when you followed the moral order led you to unhappiness. Whereas you disobeyed the moral versus disobeying the moral order that you thought would make you happy, but in fact made you unhappy. These seem to me, in my life, seem to be without exception. These are numerous. And that alone has got to inform our judgment at least a little bit.
I finally remember when I raised my hand originally.
Yes.
But first, I want to thank this guy, because he brought up a question that you didn't really answer. Getting back to the one when I'm going to raise my hand, when God destroyed the Canaanites, he didn't tell the Israelites to destroy all of them. He kept the young women.
I think my esteemed colleagues will disagree with you. There was different cases. Some cases it was everybody dies. In some cases it was keep the
Is
fathers.
that true? I thought they kept the women.
With the Canaanites, they kept the young women. With the Amalekites, they destroyed everybody.
I believe they were commanded to kill them all, but they didn't follow the command. And that was an error on their part.
Irregardless, God was at the end of his road, right? Irregardless.
It is now. Did you know that's in the it's in the dictionary now? Too many people used it and they're like,
One last point to this.
yeah.
My son, who's a homosexual, has no children, compared to me, who have been married twice and has 4 kids of my own and a stepchild. In my opinion, look, he's a much happier guy than I am.
Yeah, and that may be the case, but I would maybe conveniently argue that may not be an artifact of one variable, having kids or not having kids. Maybe you've made life choices that have made you less happy than you otherwise would have been. And he's made, and so we agree. Yeah, okay, good. That was easier than I thought. All right, we're out of time, so obviously we're not done with this topic. We'll do a little bit more on this next time. Show of hands, are we meeting? Who wants to meet next week? Okay, show of hands, who would be disappointed if we met next week? Show of hands, who doesn't care enough to raise their hand? That's solid. Seems to be a contradiction there. Okay, very good. Then we shall meet next week. Yes, sir. Very good. Y'all have a wonderful week. Happy Thanksgiving. All that stuff. Right.